everyone. So welcome to week 476 of the lockdown. Obviously it hasn't been that long, but it certainly feels that way, and I'm sure you can all relate to what I'm saying. We've all been finding ways to cope, mostly by getting on the internet and by virtually talking to people. It's actually quite funny how I've got like my little sister downstairs talking to my cousins who are in the UK and who are having quite similar issues to what we are. It just makes you realize how interconnected the world is. And really, I think this is one of the most blatant examples that is actually impacting everyone, no matter where you are, of how the world has become global and how that global world has its positives and its negatives. But this is my way of segueing into the episode that I planned for this week, and that was basically how the world is incredibly interdependent and what that means for politics. So I'm thinking back to last week's episode that I hope you've all seen. If you haven't, I'm going to take this moment to tell you to go and take a quick look at it and leave your comments below.
Okay, so when events like COVID happens, it sends the international system into a bit of a flux. So suddenly you've got politicians and the economic actors scrambling to work what's going on, how to cope with the changes, how those changes are going to impact the future, whether those changes are just on a micro level or whether they're on a macro level. So right now is a good time for us to think about globalization and how interdependence is here to stay. The whole time we were doing our degree, we kept having to consider whether or not the global system was eroding. And the conclusion I kind of came to basically was that globalization isn't disappearing. It's deepening, meaning it's becoming more embedded into the system. If you look around you, because of tech advances, the kind of boundaries that existed before between states, between individuals, between even businesses, they're not as hard. They don't pose as many barriers as they did in the past. Some of this is because of tech. So technology, the digital world has basically made connections so much easier. You can send, like I was saying before, you can send messages from Pakistan to England in like literally it's there as soon as you send it. Same thing with money, products, everything. We're living in a world where things just happen so fast, and that has had a huge impact on the political system, on the economic system, and on the way that the world is running. So globalization is becoming more embedded in the world. The globalization's effects are becoming more embedded in this system. And I don't think it would be that easy to reverse the effects. It wouldn't be that easy to close off close off states, as you can see with everything that was going on with, if you refer to the case of Brexit, if you refer to Trump and the way that he is trying to become more isolated, but at the same time he has to cope with his position in the international system. So anyway, I don't want to go off track. Basically my point is that globalization is not new, but the scale and scope of it is unprecedented. And one of the things is unprecedented is how interdependent the world has become. If you look at liberal theory, they will focus on a lot economic interdependence and how the trade networks has enabled and solidified it. I was reading an article, but basically they were talking about how the global social economic infrastructure looks and works like a hub and spoke network in which all the nodes are separated by very short distances and essential functions are centralized in large hubs. So financial activity, for example, is concentrated in the United States. But on the other hand, you've got China, which is the world's manufacturing center. And this structure is geared towards maximizing efficiency by capturing the benefits of economics of scale and specialization. So if you look at the way the international system works and it's linked to capitalism, everything is about making more. Everything is about doing things faster. It's about, the whole of the system is very consumerist. If you look at like fast fashion, if you look at the way that tech companies update their phones every few months, everything is about what you can make the most efficiently, and what can you make, what processes can make it the cheapest. It's creating a kind of societal, political, economical situation where the international system benefits from interdependence, because trade has interconnected. The sheer scale of trade and the way that free trade and economic liberalization, as they call it, works is by connecting different countries and making sure those countries do what they do best in order to create a situation where capitalism can flourish. The result of it is that the policies from one country impact the policies of the other. So if Russia has policies on gas, those policies are going to affect transport costs in somewhere like Europe. If there's a trade war between China and the USA, every single country in the world is going to be worried about that, because of the fact that it will affect the choices that they make. Because of their central position in the international system, is going to have an impact on the global economy and thus on every state within the global economy. So, to quote the World Bank, the Chinese and the trade war between China and the USA led to financial conditions tightening, industrial production being moderated, trade tensions intensifying, and some large emerging markets in developing economies experiencing significant financial market stress. And because of the choices that China and the USA were making, the recovery in the emerging market and developing economies has lost its momentum. So you can see how today, because of globalization, because of the system that the USA and the allies that won the World War II set up, every country is interconnected, every country is dependent on one another, and they all work within one system as separate entities, and whatever each country does has a knock-on effect on others. Now this, in liberal theory, the idea was that this would help to reduce war, because war would no longer be between two countries or three countries. It would, whatever those countries decided to do, would impact everyone else. So there's kind of a peer pressure to stay away from direct war, which is why when I was following the kind of conflict with North Korea and America, I didn't see war as being imminent, even though they were making a big deal about the nuclear weapons, because it would be mutual self-destruction, not just because of the nuclear weapons, but because of the impact of those two countries going to war would have on the economy, and thus how the countries around it would be against it. So interdependence basically means that there's a mutual dependence between states, and liberals focus on how this was necessary to reduce war and conflict. Their argument being that the fact that states are mutually dependent for receiving goods, they would be less inclined to reduce their foreign policy to national security issues, and would be more focused on their economic interests, which would make them consider more peaceful solutions. And I think that can be seen in the international system, and it is why things like if you read into the history of the last, say from Obama's time onwards, it could be before that, but mainly by what I've read, is from Obama's time onwards, China was rising economically, and it kept stressing in its foreign policy that it wanted to rise peacefully. It kept stressing that it was not trying to compete with America, because at the end of the day, American and the China's interests are attached because of the fact that they are working within the same interdependent international system. When I was reading into this, I kept coming across is that the trade is what's connected the countries. So the countries trying to maximize their trade potential is what has made these countries interdependent. And what I was kind of wanted to also think about a bit and talk about in this episode a bit is how it's not just trade. It's also the way that, for me, it's also the way that the dollar works. So after World War II, the dollar became central to the international system. And now, if you look at it, I think almost all the financial activity happens with the dollar, which is why it's so important to keep the dollar stable. After World War II, because of America's economic dominance at a time where all the other powerful nations were economically weak, it held a lot of power. So America, for example, at that time held most of the world's gold and tied its currency to gold. So people, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to try and explain all of this. Basically, the states became very reliant on the dollar, and that reliance increased when America decided to stop it from being linked to gold and just tied the dollar itself to the international system, creating a situation where today most of the international transactions are done in the dollar. I'm saying most of because there are certain circumstances, like I think where India has created another way of doing its transactions with other states in something other than the dollar. But basically, on the whole, the dominance of the dollar has created a system where, not just because of trade, but also because of finance, the countries are economically interdependent. Evidence in the fact that when the economy in America collapsed, it had a knock-on effect on all the states across the world. And what I found interesting was the fact that the states did not turn around and say, okay, US economy is weak and susceptible to a crisis, that we should, and they didn't go for alternatives. They stuck to the dollar and instead put measures in place to stabilize it. America depends on China for its, not just its low-cost trade routes and products. It also depends on China for providing funding for its budget deficits, and it's the largest foreign holder of US Treasury securities, and I'll put up the exact amount on screen, and this amount is from 2018, so it might have changed a bit since then, but it's an interesting fact because China isn't the only holder. It's one of the holders, and it's the largest holder. I think Japan was the largest holder before China overtook it. But my point here is the fact that all the countries and all of their economies are interlinked. They are interdependent. And because of that, the world is a very interesting place. I've talked a lot about how the world is connected, about how tech has led to globalization deepening, how and what impacts this has had on states. But I mentioned something a few minutes ago, which was the fact that you've got an international system, and within that international system you've got a lot of individual state entities working, and those individual state entities are interdependent because of finance and economy. But we cannot forget that they are still individual states, and they are still looking for their best interests. So even though things like war has decreased, it does not mean that they are all going to have the same foreign policy. It does not mean that they will always make the same decisions that they will always make decisions that seem economically viable. Can't forget that the international system is still state-centric, and because of that, security issues integral to their decision making. It's just that the way that they approach the security issues, or how blatant they are about the security issues, will differ. So that's all for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a good week and let me know what you think in the comments below. Bye!